Most of us are familiar with the image of the romantic artist who suffers and toils away alone, horribly misunderstood by critics. And I'll be discussing paintings from this exhibition. So if you're in lockdown and have yet to see the exhibition, hopefully this will get you excited for when we're all able to be out and about again. Now, celebrity is everywhere in the contemporary, but not particularly well understood. And I thought it might be interesting to ask, where and when does this enthusiasm for biography and the notion that an artist must suffer for their art emerge? What are its historical origins, and how might it be related to our appetite for celebrity culture? And finally, what does it reveal about ourselves? Now, there are many examples in the history of European art where we can begin teasing out the concept of the tortured genius. And I wanted to start with this painting that features in the exhibition European Masters from the Met, because Van Gogh is one of the most beloved tortured geniuses in art's history. There is probably no other artist that we associate so closely with these ideas of suffering for your art than Van Gogh. He occupies a special place both in art history and popular culture. He is so well known, and perhaps more than any other Western European painter, and his reproductions of his works are sold more than any other artist from any other school or period or country. And he is the subject of innumerable books, films, novels, televisions, documentaries. He even has his own museum. So there's a culture industry that surrounds Van Gogh. Now, if you notice in this slide from the painting, this thick application of paint and these lively brushstrokes are often interpreted by commentators as visible signs of his inner turmoil. Now, this is a cover of a 1967 book that was written by Alan Honor. And on its cover is a very famous self-portrait by Van Gogh that was painted just before his death. Now, Van Gogh's renown is based on his unhappy life. And the point I am making with including this slide is it's the whole of the cultural production, the books, the films, the biopics that reinforce this narrative. Contemporary audiences continue to display a fascination with the tortured genius, and we have a reverence for suffering. It is often seen as cool or romantic for artists to be self-destructive, and this is perhaps because art is often seen and interpreted as a reflection of the inner self. But is this particularly helpful for young and emerging artists? The act of art making can be torturous, but let's not confuse this with our own reverence for suffering or an index of quality. At its best, the cult of the suffering artist may be seen as generating broad public interest in the visual arts. We are genuinely curious about artists' lives and what makes artists, well, great. At its worst, the notion that an artist must suffer for their work perpetuates a dangerous and even toxic stereotype, especially for emerging artists and their audiences. And there are plenty of examples that we can point to in cinema, such as Ed Harris's biopic on Jackson Pollock, who was an American abstract expressionist painter, painting in the 1940s and 1950s, and famously died too early in a car crash. Now, while he is revered for his abstract drip paintings, Pollock also wrestled with alcohol addiction issues, tumultuous relationships, and a long-suffering partner, Lee Krasner. And this is part of the reason why cinema lends itself so well to the genre. These are just great stories. If we were to reach back a little further, Derek Jarman's Caravaggio from 1986. Now, this is an extraordinary film in its own right, and I'm thinking here in particular of the set design and lighting. But the larger question that I would like to ask is, what mythologies do films such as Caravaggio reinforce? I think as audiences, we need to be acutely aware that when we watch films such as this, we are consuming and participating in an idea about the tortured artist that has a long and rich history that extends back hundreds of years. This history is often presented to us as natural and true. The same is true with exhibitions, and we also need to be alert to the fact that exhibitions are never necessarily benign or neutral things. Exhibitions contain traces of intellectual history, of values, of ideas and ideologies. So can we divorce the artist from the art? And should we? This painting is directly from the exhibition that's currently on show and shows the beloved painter Fra Angelico. And just notice the sumptuous gold background that the figures are placed in. We can just start to see the emergence of what art historians called linear perspective, or the creation of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional picture plane. You can see how the Virgin Mary in the immediate foreground has been foreshortened by Fra Angelico by placing her on the diagonal. And if you notice the horses on the right-hand side, they are positioned so that they are stacking, or one behind the other. This was actually quite hard to do. Later, artists of the Renaissance went on to use architecture to help create these visual cues and this illusion of spatial depth. But when we begin thinking through our relationship with European art, one of the most interesting and important conversations that is currently underway in arts history is who is in the canon and who is left out. This question has been intensified in the last 24 months in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. Museums and institutions around the world are revisiting and revising their acquisition strategies. And when we examine an exhibition such as Masterpieces from the Met, we can begin to chart a certain story or narrative of art's development over the centuries. The Western European canon is generally presented to us as a straight line. Fra Angelico leads to Paul Cézanne, who leads to Jackson Pollock. And to maintain this line, underlying assumptions must be maintained, such as ideas around creativity and genius. This development is much like a roadmap. And when we look, it's actually possible to identify different ideas about what an artist was and what their role and function in society was, and how this has changed over the centuries. And so it's in this context that the notion of the tortured genius was really born. During the Middle Ages, the professions of painters and sculptors were regulated by medieval guild systems. Sculptors, for example, belonged to the Guild of Stone and Woodworkers, and their colleagues carved fireplaces and furniture. Fra Angelico was just on the cusp of this, and it was during the Renaissance that the idea of the modern artist began to truly emerge. The artist as a genius, as a unique personality, and as an individual who could gain status and prestige in society. So this shift, or the rise of the artist from craftsman to genius, is one of the principal achievements of the Renaissance, and also one of its enduring legacies. As the earliest painter in the exhibition, we actually don't know that much about Fra Angelico's life compared to the artists of the High Renaissance, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, or Michelangelo. And this is because he lived a long time before the first biographer of artists' lives, Giorgio Vasari, was writing. We know that Fra Angelico was a Dominican monk, and he probably lived a devout and simple life. Now, Giorgio Vasari is important regarding this history of the idea of the genius, because he identified it as a desirable character trait in the 1600s. Now, Vasari is often referred to as the father of art history. He was a Tuscan painter, architect, collector, and writer, and he is best known as the author of the Vitae, or the Lives of the Artists. This was first published in Florence in 1580, and the Lives is generally considered the first proper art history. Now, much of what we know about the Renaissance, for better or for worse, comes to us from Vasari, and it continues to help shape our views and perceptions. Vasari was writing at a time when there was a lessening role of theology and the church. Now, while still incredibly important, man was beginning to replace God as at the center of the world. This is also the birth of the modern subject in the individualistic sense that we understand today. Now, Vasari pursued a biographical approach, and so he was more inaccurate about the artists he knew. He was a student of Michelangelo's, and his account of Michelangelo's life, therefore, is incredibly detailed. Now, the Lives was not straightforward biographical accounts by any means. Vasari also had an agenda. He was developing a theory of aesthetics that underscored a theory of ingenio or divine, and created inspiration and the importance of disegno or design. So each artist's life was a character study that had a particular moralistic and aesthetic purpose. And so hence Vasari approved of Fra Angelico because of his devout piety. Now, importantly, in terms of understanding the history of this idea of genius, Vasari's lives set the standard for autobiographical accounts of art history. It helps us understand how this conflation between biography and practice came into being. Now, when we start thinking about the tortured genius, there are probably about 5 variations or tropes that we can start to identify. But let's start with the first one, the idea of the creator, or the artist who rises above the ordinary mortal and acquires a semi-divine status. Michelangelo, for instance, was dubbed by his contemporaries as Il Divino. Now, being a good artist involves talent and skill. Being a genius artist is a way of packaging oneself to the public. Artists make self-portraits for many reasons, but usually artists make self-portraits not just for themselves, but with viewers in mind. The self-portrait is at once a claim to and a representation of creativity, and hence why it becomes so interesting to us when we think about the idea of artistic genius. Art historians are in general agreement that Dürer deliberately styled himself in the likeness of Jesus Christ. And here we have an example where Dürer's conception of art as a matter of genius had assumed a deeply religious significance, and genius becomes conflated with God. Dürer is not challenging God's power, but is instead assuming a semi-divine status as heir to the original creator himself. So the growth of self-portraiture as a genre signaled this newfound self-confidence that artists were experiencing. Dürer had more freedom than most because he made money through his print reproductions. He was therefore less reliant on commissions or patrons. Now, in this painting by French painter Jerome from 1890, which is included in the exhibition, we can see another variation of this idea of the divine or quasi-divine powers of the artist as creator. In Jerome's activation of the myth Pygmalion and Galatea. In this slide, you can see a man and half woman, half sculpture embracing, and it is as if through the man's touch, the sculpture is coming to life. Now, the story actually came to Jerome through the Roman poet Ovid's and his Metamorphosis. And Ovid tells the story of a sculptor and king of Cyprus, Pygmalion, who falls in love with his own creation, a woman carved from ivory. With a little help from the goddess Venus, the statue comes to life and Pygmalion makes her his wife. The myth of Pygmalion and Galatea was an incredibly popular subject for many artists of the 18th and 19th centuries, as Pygmalion was imagined as creative and even godlike genius. It's another way of fashioning the artistic self in this lineage. As we continue to flesh out this idea of the tortured artist, the second trope I'd like to point to is melancholia and its close cousin, madness. Now, melancholia's roots are ancient and reach all the way back to Aristotle. Basically, melancholy was considered as one of the 4 temperaments that matched the 4 humours. It was believed that people were healthy when all the humours were perfectly in harmony, and sickness was the result of a imbalance in the humours. Now, in this image, I'd just like to draw your attention to what is considered a visual allegory by Dürer that has become a sort of emblem or enduring symbol of melancholia. Just notice the winged female figure that's sitting in a state of pensive gloom. Now, much ink has been spilled dedicated to this etching. However, art historians generally believe that the figure is a spiritual self-portrait of the artist himself. And it reminds us of just how flexible the genre of self-portraiture can prove to be. This etching has become a sort of icon or symbol of melancholia. Now, this incredible hunting scene by Piero di Cosimo is included in the exhibition. And unlike the graceful perfection of the figures of the High Renaissance, Piero di Cosimo's figures are twisted and contorted as naked men and satyrs slaughter animals that have been flushed out of a forest to escape a fire. It's quite a gruesome hunting scene, and de Cosimo has deployed an unusual compositional device in the middle of the painting, which is truncated by a tree. This has an unusual effect on the spectator as we are simultaneously drawn into the scene and then thwarted by the tree. De Cosimo makes it difficult for us to relax, to let our eye wander and get absorbed in the incredible detail. Now, unlike the well-rounded and noble geniuses that was constructed as gentlemen, such as Michelangelo or Leonardo, Piero di Cosimo presents a very different type of genius and helps shape the image of what is known as the mad genius. According to Vasari, he lived in squalor and ate eggs, 50 at a time. Now, Vasari's anecdotes have shaped how we continue to receive de Cosimo's legacy, and it's nearly impossible to separate out paintings such as this from Vasari's stories and anecdotes. The third variation of the tortured genius is the genius as a lover. And this idea again gained momentum in the Renaissance, and at surface value seems innocent enough. Now, this painting by Raphael is in the exhibition, and according to one of Vasari's more salacious tales, Raphael died after an evening of passionate lovemaking. He was struck down by a violent fever. Now, Raphael wasn't entirely honest with his doctors as to what he'd been up to all night, and his doctors misdiagnosed his illness as being caused by heat stroke and bloodletting. He passed away soon after, and he was only 37. When I was thinking about this presentation, I really wanted to highlight how these founding myths of genius migrate through art's history. And so in this painting, the French painter Gogh depicts Raphael and his mistress, La Fornarina, sitting on his knee. It is a strategy of paying homage to the great artists who came before you, as well as aligning yourself with their legacy. And Raphael is caught up in the turmoil between his mistress and his art, and Gogh shows him looking wistfully at his canvas. Now, Picasso took up the same theme in a series of etchings where he actually includes himself as a voyeur on the right, and you can see him looking through some curtains at Raphael and La Fornarina. Now, there is, of course, a deadly side to all of this. A proclivity for reprehensible acts is built right into the myth of the artistic genius, and Picasso is one of the main culprits. The stereotype of the virile lover becomes troubling in the contemporary era as the art world reckons with the Me Too movement. What was once tolerated and even celebrated as normative behaviour is now considered a highly inappropriate use and abuse of power. The fourth trope I'd like to discuss now as we flesh out this historical idea of genius is the notion of the outlier. The genius as tortured outlier is the artist who eschews convention. For instance, in the second half of the 19th century, French Impressionism created a dramatic break with the art of the past. And part of the enduring popularity of the Impressionists is the romantic story of a group of young artists who are battling against the conservatism of the French salon and the academy. Now, this narrative invariably perpetuates the notion of the male artist as genius outliers. And when we think of the artists that are in the exhibition, such as Manet, Renoir or Monet, they have been positioned repeatedly in the literature as rogue radicals who shun the establishment, who broke the rules by abandoning prevailing convention. Now, in actual fact, many of the Impressionist artists were actually quite close to the establishment, and some figures such as Renoir and Degas did exhibit regularly with the official salon exhibitions. But if we were to reach back a little further, it's possible to detect this impulse with one of the most beloved of Renaissance painters, Caravaggio, who established for himself quite a reputation for living a violent life. And when we look back through the literature, time and time again, art historians have conflated Caravaggio's personality with his art. Even one of his earliest commentators, Valori, who was writing about 60 years after Caravaggio's death, he wrote, quote, "Driven by his peculiar temperament, Caravaggio gave himself up to the dark manner and to the expression of his turbulent and contentious nature." And I'm thinking here of later works by Caravaggio, such as Judith beheading Holofernes from around 1602, and shows Judith in the gruesome act of beheading Holofernes. Now, Caravaggio achieved notoriety in his own lifetime on account of a violent and loutish life. He built up a lengthy criminal record for various cases of assault, and in 1606, it is believed he killed a man. He fled Rome and spent the remaining years as a fugitive. Now, this painting, The Musicians, which is in the exhibition, was painted just on the cusp of what is considered by Caravaggio scholars his mature style. The figures are crowded into a narrow, shallow space, which is a trademark compositional technique of Caravaggio's. He's not particularly interested in positioning his figures in a broader landscape, but instead places them in the immediate foreground where they almost fall into the spectator's space. This helps us understand why Caravaggio's paintings are read in terms of being highly psychological and emotional. The fact that Caravaggio's realism was highly original for its time is foundational to the construction of the notion of the genius as outlier. He is one of the first artists in history to disregard the idea that the object of the work of art had to be beautiful and to improve and embellish nature. It is also a deliberate strategy of distancing himself from the enormous legacy of Michelangelo. As opposed to aligning himself, his choice of artistic style tends to be read as a repudiation. Now, this painting that's in the exhibitions by the French realist painter, Gustave Courbet, and it's considered an outlier, and he's considered an outlier because he challenged convention. Not unlike Caravaggio, he was decried by critics for his realism and his insistence on painting what he saw. In the 1840s and 1850s, the official art that was promoted by the Academy privileged paintings of religious or historical subjects that delivered an overtly moral or heroic message to the audience. Courbet's landscapes such as this were highly unusual at the time. He did set the scene, however, for the Impressionist artists that took up the idea of painting outside the studio and attempting to record what they saw as opposed to a dressed up or idealized myth in the studio. Now, this painting by Paul Cézanne that's in the show reminds us of just how controversial the French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were to contemporary critics. So another way of thinking about the genius as tormented outlier is the notion of withdrawing into solitude. In a letter to his former student, Vasari, Michelangelo wrote, "There is no peace to be found except in the woods." And Leonardo similarly wrote that the painter must live alone, contemplate what his eye perceives, and to commune with himself. It is believed that this necessity to withdraw started with Renaissance scholars and poets and was taken up by artists quite enthusiastically. Despite having short stints in Paris as a young man, Cézanne chose to work in increasing isolation, usually painting in the south of France. By the time Gardin was painted in the mid-1980s, Cézanne had withdrawn from his associations, both with the Impressionist group as well as old childhood friends, such as the writer Émile Zola. His work was received with hostility by critics who were highly contemptuous for the unfinished or blank areas on the canvas. And if you have a close look at the image, you can see how Cézanne left the preliminary pencil lines there, giving them equal weighting with the more solid painterly volumes. The brushstrokes that make up the sky are incredibly sketchy. This is another extraordinary painting that is included in the exhibition, Cézanne's Still Life with Apples and Pears from 1891 to 1892. Now, Cézanne was famously drawn to the genre of still lives because he could not bear being in the presence of people. He works slowly and methodically, which does not suit most people. And if you look closely, Cézanne's apples and pears occupy an extremely shallow pictorial space, not unlike the space of Caravaggio's musicians. The tabletop appears to tilt vertically, and it's almost as if the apples could roll off the table. Now, another important work that's included in the exhibition is Paul Gauguin's Tahitian Landscape from 1892. And these various strains of sexual libido and the outsider come together when we consider a figure such as Gauguin, who left France for the South Pacific. He first sailed to the French colony of Tahiti in 1891 in the hope of finding a paradise and to escape what he described as the perversion of European culture at the time. He was searching for a visual language that could give him a purity of expression that was uncontaminated by the West. Now, Gauguin's proclivity for sexually exploiting Tahitian women as young as 13 has left his legacy highly contested. It also reminds us that the tortured genius has a much darker side and needs to be called out for what it is. Gauguin was a sexual predator who abused his position of power. Now, this work is not in the exhibition, but I popped it in because I thought it would just round out this trope of the tortured artist as outlier quite nicely. This is a recent neon work by the English artist Tracey Emin, and it also acknowledges this strain of solitude that accompanies the tortured artist. Now, Emin frequently works with neon text, and her practice is generally recognized for its frank and direct address to the audience. Now, just to create some context in case you're not familiar with her work, Emin is a contemporary English practitioner who works across mediums and came to prominence via her association with the young British artist phenomena in the 1990s in England. Also provides a great entree into the next section, the vexed relationship between gender and genius. So the final trope that I wanted to tease out today was the gendering of the notion of artistic genius. You might have noticed until this point that I've discussed a lot of male artists because the understanding of artistic genius has been so long associated with the privileges and traits that are associated with masculinity. Women artists have effectively been locked out of the conversation. So the notion of genius is highly gendered. To overcome the canon's bias towards male artists requires enormous shifts, but it also requires a rethinking of how we view art's history as a history of art rather than a history of artistic personalities. And so starting around the 1970s, feminist art historians started challenging the canon and the ideas pertaining to artistic genius. Now, this shift was initiated by feminist art historian Linda Nochlin, who in 1971, crazily 50 years ago, wrote a very famous landmark essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? The question, Nochlin argued, is implicitly biased. It assumes there aren't any women artists because women don't have genius like male artists do. So to expand the canon, it would be logical to argue women artists are as equally capable as their male counterparts. However, things are never as simple as that would effectively mean another turn of the screw. The absence of women had nothing to do with lack of genius or talent. Instead, it was structural. And at the crux of Nochlin's argument was women were excluded because they had no access to an art education. They were locked out of the academies and considered too feeble for life drawing. Now, of course, there were some exceptions, and here I would point to Artemisia Gentileschi or Vigie Lebrun, as their success can be attributed in part to their family ties. They were the daughters of artist fathers, so they had access to an education. But the shift Nochlin was calling for was institutional and away from the emphasis on the individual. And so I just want to point out another thing while we're on this slide. Linda Nochlin's essay appeared in January 1971 on the cover of Art News. Now, the issue's cover reproduced an 1801 portrait from the Met's collection, which was at one point attributed to the French painter Jacques-Louis David. Now, this painting has since been attributed to Marie-Denise Villet. And in France, in the immediate wake of the French Revolution, there was a decade of open experimentation where women artists started appearing on the scene, and there was a window of opportunity for education. This window was sadly short-lived, and Villet was one of the artists who made the most of the openness at the time. Now, the other woman artist who is included in the exhibition is Vigie Lebrun, and who was very prominent in royal and court circles in pre-revolutionary France. And she is famous for being a favorite painter to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. But women artists of this period, the handful of ones that were able to overcome the institutional restrictions to education, they were expected to be both beautiful and desirable. And in her own memoirs, Vigie Lebrun recollected, in those days, beauty really was an advantage. So this is her self-portrait, which is held in the National Gallery in London. And again, self-image is vital to her popularity. Her beauty was very much part of her popular appeal, and just notice how fashionably well-dressed she is. The richness of her clothing projects a sense of wealth and luxury, but it also demonstrates her skill. She is also offering herself as a beautiful object to be looked at, something to be enjoyed and admired. And notice how she's holding her brushes and her palette very elegantly. The paint is neatly arranged to imitate the flowers on her hat. As an image of an 18th century artist, it's difficult to be convinced. A woman was acceptable as an artist, but on an entirely different scale and criteria to those that was applied to men, not as genius, but as a sexual object of desire. I just want to touch now on how this gendering of genius has been taken up by contemporary artists who use emotion and their memories as their subject matter. So for 30 years, Tracey Emin has activated the trope of the melancholic artist, this tradition that reaches back as far as Dürer's engraving of Melancholia. Now, Emin works in a diaristic mode of address and sets up intimate or confessional relationships with the spectator. And the inability to separate Emin's life from Emin's practice is entirely the point. One way we can read Emin's practice is not so much a portal into a tortured soul, but instead she's working with the language of expressionism. We can never really know Tracey Emin. However, we can read her style, her brushstrokes, as activating this long history of expressionist painters that reaches back to Van Gogh. And think back to the painting that we started with at the start of the presentation. And I thought I would pop this slide in just because this is a pairing. This is an exhibition that paired the great Norwegian expressionist painter Edvard Munch and Emin, and this exhibition just closed at the Royal Academy in London. And so the question I'll pose for you is Emin completing Munch's project or parodying it? And it is this ambiguity that is fascinating. Now, if we were to reach back a little bit further, I'd just like to finish with Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, whose practice was consumed with themes of pain and suffering. Now, Kahlo was in a terrible streetcar accident when she was 18, and the accident fractured her ribs, her collarbone, broke her legs, her feet, and she spent the rest of her life in chronic pain. Now, Kahlo's self-portraits are typically understood as a means of giving visible representation to this pain. This painting was painted how she felt after miscarrying while she was living in New York at the Henry Ford Hospital. And it raises some important provocative questions. What does the tortured genius look like for women artists? Is the stereotype only capable of giving visibility to the most painful, the most difficult parts of women's lives? And then what does that reveal about us and our appetite for celebrity culture and our willingness to consume other people's pain? Now here I have an image of Salma Hayek, who starred as Frida Kahlo in Julie Taymor's film from 2002. Now, Kahlo's life was undeniably tragic. And when I was rewatching this film through the week and preparing for the lecture, it was heartbreaking to realize that Kahlo only had one solo exhibition in her lifetime in 1953. So like many artists in this exhibition, Kahlo's practice really only came to light after her passing. I just want to make some final observations. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with getting drawn into the details of individual artists' lives. We do need to think critically, however, about how these histories are constructed and what power relationships they might conceal as natural. And things become trickier, however, in when we demand or expect our artists, our actors, our musicians, our performers to be tortured. There is no concrete evidence that links the relationship between genius and creativity, and the research that's been done in disciplines such as psychology is inconclusive. The category of the tortured artist, whose history we've been tracing today, is not based on biology or psychology, but is instead a highly encoded social category. Now, there are plenty of tortured artists in the world because some artists live tortured lives. Making art is hard. To successfully communicate something to an audience is a hard thing to do. If we cannot see the evidence of the torture, then somehow we feel we have been duped or tricked. If an artist struggles, it gives them legitimacy. Now, we do know that artists suffer from mental health issues at the same rate as the rest of the community, approximately 1 in 4. And artists may also experience mental health issues, often because they live in precarious living situations, have limited or unreliable institutional support in a highly competitive market. And all these factors contribute to poor mental health, whether we're an artist or not. But to demand that an artist suffers from poor mental health as evidence of their value or worth is feeding a centuries-old toxic and potentially noxious stereotype. Thank you. I'll finish there.